Hi everyone, my name is Autumn and I'll be introducing some site navigation principles to you that will help improve the flow of your website and the overall structure. Looking at what site navigation is, it's pretty simple. It helps the user get from one place to another on the internet. So the elements that we'll be looking at are kind of like bridges that help people to get from one page to another. Site navigation is very important because it affects the overall user experience. Users are much likely to stay on your page or to return to it if they can find what they're looking for easily. The first step to creating a site with great organization is to organize your ideas. Clear organization and structure make a site easy for a visitor to navigate. And here's an example of an activity you can do to get organized. A card sort activity is where you write down ideas for your pages on different cards and then sort them into piles that make conceptual sense. This type of grouping helps you to determine a flowchart for your website. This site map is a way for you to see exactly how your site navigation will work and where a user will go from each page. When you have this organized, you're able to create a wireframe of each page. This is very important for navigation as well because right from the start you already know where your navigation elements will be placed. You can use a low fidelity one like the example to the left, which is pretty much just boxes, or a more high fidelity example like the one on the right that could show you exactly where buttons and links will go. So with those organizational tips in mind, here are 20 more specific tips to help you streamline site navigation. The first tip is actually one of the Gestalt design principles, the principle of proximity. This, as you can see, it involves grouping things in your mind. So when you look at a website that has a lot of options, like the Southwest Airlines website, you want to make sure that items are grouped together in a way that makes sense for the user so that they can find what they're looking for. The second principle is that of similarity. So we tend to group things in our mind based on color, based on shape, and size. So using these elements, you want to organize your site so that it feels cohesive and people can group things in a way that makes sense. The principle of continuity has to do with the invisible lines that we create based on how things are laid out. So if you see an arrow, for example, your eye tends to continue along the line until it reaches the head of that arrow, which is where your eye was led. So on a website, we tend to organize menus in a way that will lead the viewer's eye from one element to the next. So that's just something to consider as you come up with your layout. The fourth tip is to try to reduce the site depth. As you design your website, you want to try to make things very easily accessible from the home page and not go too many pages deep. This will really help people when they're trying to navigate your site. The fifth tip, think minimalistic. Try to think about how many things you can take away from the page instead of how many things you can add. In these two examples, the one on the left has a lot of elements that can really distract from navigation because the user doesn't really know where to go in order to find what they're looking for. The example on the right is much more streamlined. The TouchText site only has 4 items in their navigation menu, and that makes it really easy to find where you're going. Tip number 6 might seem to contradict our last tip, but using mega menus for sites with lots of content is a really great idea because it keeps all of that content off of the home page. For example, e-commerce sites or restaurant sites like the Starbucks one that have a lot of menu options make use of these mega menus to show a lot of options without having to put them right there on the home page. Tip number 7 is to make your navigation bar sticky and other elements of navigation as well. You've probably been on a site where there was an annoying advertisement that scrolled along the page with you. We don't want to use those annoying advertisements, but we can make the navigation bar sticky so that as the user scrolls down on a page with a lot of content, they're always able to access the navigation and move around the site easily. Number 8 is to consider using images as buttons. This menu for Disney parks and resorts is very attractive because of the photography that they used to accompany each item on the menu. This also has to do with other images on your website. Images can be a very powerful way for people to navigate a site. For example, if an image seems like it should lead somewhere, it should be a link. A site with a picture of a book cover on it seems like that book cover should lead to more information about the book when clicked on. This principle is why Pinterest is one of the leading sources of site traffic as far as links on the internet go. So make sure that you take your images into consideration as navigation tools. Tip number 9 is to increase the contrast on your website. This will make the navigation elements really stand out. You can see the contrasting elements on the right image are much more defined than the ones on the left, and that means that a user is more likely to click on them. Tip number 10 is to choose your labels wisely. You don't want buttons that are essays, and you don't want to create items that don't really give the user information about where they lead. You should always have text that explains where a button will take the user, and then a button with clear descriptive labels. Outbound links should always open in a new tab. This is very important not only as a courtesy to people who use your site, but for your site itself. Because if a user is taken away from your site every time that they click on a link, they're not likely to go back to that site. Tip number 12 is to use location indicators. When a person has a lot of options on a site as far as what page they're on, it can get kind of confusing to know exactly where they're located. So using location indicators such as a subpage menu or labeling exactly what the article is called help a user to navigate the website more easily. This works great especially for news article websites or blogs or websites that have a lot of content and articles for a user to sift through. Tip number 13 is to use interactive navigation links. This can be done in CSS using the link attributes. You can make a link a different color when you hover over it, or have a different state based on what the user is doing. You can use the HTML title attribute as well to give the users more specific information about an element when they scroll over it. This often shows up as a tooltip when you mouse over an item and a little text field pops up telling you what exactly that means. Tip 14 is to use icons that are recognizable. This is pretty self-explanatory, but you don't want to use something that the user won't recognize as a navigation element. Number 15 is to consider that users are switching over to mobile platforms very often as they use the internet, so you want to have responsive navigation elements. In the example on the right, you can see that the browser design is different from the mobile design, and this helps users to be able to have a better experience on your site. Tip number 16 is to suggest next tasks to users after they complete something. For example, on this website Medium, after a user has interacted with something, they're suggested additional people who they can follow, or giving the user the option to subscribe to something. This is great because the user is being directed to a way that they can continue engaging with content that they already find interesting. So this helps users navigate your site in a way that appeals to them personally. Our next tip is to make the homepage accessible from anywhere on your site. The logo that traditionally appears on the top left of websites should always be clickable and lead back to the home link. And some sites like Google and W3 Tools have improved this further by adding a tooltip when you mouse over to tell the user that yes, this is a link and this is where you will go when you click on it. Our next tip is to incorporate the F layout. In this image you can see what looks like a heat map of a website, and this shows they've actually done studies to show where people's eyes move when they use a website, and it follows this distinctive pattern that looks like an F. So if you put your navigation elements along this F pattern, which is the top of the page and along the left side, they'll be more accessible for people to use. You might also want to consider putting your most important content along that layout. Tip number 19 is to stick to what works. Some websites don't have great navigation simply because it's too far out there. This website, for example, has, you can't see the animation in this, but all of those little elements actually spin around the man's head, and so you have to try to catch the page that you're looking for as it spins around. This doesn't really work as a navigation tool. It's not very efficient. The other side to that, however, is tip number 20, be creative. There are certain things that work in navigation and there are certain things that don't, but you can always be creative about using the things that do work. This Nimble Tank website, for example, makes great use of a simple menu that expands to become a transparent menu on top of the page, which is a little different from your traditional method. To conclude this, there are so many great sources out there for navigation principles. Here are some that I used, and you can look up more. And consider ways to improve your site navigation as a tool to help your users and also to help your site overall. Thank you for watching.